for a moment. All right, we are live. Welcome everybody. I want to welcome you today to this episode of Cosmic Sankofa's Cosmic Room. Today we are talking with Professor Nubia Kai, if I can call you, if that, she was an instructor at Howard University, and she's written an amazing book about a topic that many of us, we don't really know much of history about. It's not really discussed, although the history is there. And if you're in the local areas where it occurred, it's there in your history and you know about it. But for those of us in America, we don't really hear about Maroons in America. We don't hear about Maroon action in America. For those of you that are not familiar with what a Maroon is, it was Maroons were Africans who rebelled against the system, ran away from their captors and established their own sovereign colonies in areas where they found themselves. And Sister Nubia Kai, our Professor Nubia Kai, can go more in depth with that. And so I'd like to welcome and thank Professor Nubia Kai to the show. Thank you, Professor, for being here.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm trying to get situated here. So first of all, I'd like to maybe talk about the meaning of Maroons, the definition of Maroons. It really kind of started as a pejorative from the Spanish. It comes from the word cimarron. And cimarron was what they called animals, like cattle, hogs, and other animals who had escaped and were living in the wild. So it's like they were self-liberated, domesticated animals that had become undomesticated. So when you had enslaved people who were leaving the plantations and farms and fleeing and setting up their own communities, they started using that same term and referring to them, like people living in the wilds. And I understand in Jamaica, they kind of embraced the term. It's like, yes, that's exactly what we are. So they kind of wore the term proudly, Maroons. And of course, there has been a lot of writing about the Maroons in Jamaica. You had large nation states, the Quilombos in Brazil, in Guyana, in Suriname. You had independent nation states of Maroons, also in Colombia and Venezuela and Mexico. So these people settled in their own independent communities where they armed and defended themselves against national military forces and local patrols. Now, far less is known about the presence of Maroon communities in the United States, even though you did have them in the United States. In fact, they were just as powerful and formidable when we include the Seminoles, which was a confederation of enslaved Africans who had been Maroons in Florida for almost a century. And then they were joined up with the Creek, a branch of the Creeks who broke away from the Creeks who wanted to assimilate. And then together they were collectively called the Seminole, but they included the Seminole Maroons, or that is the enslaved Africans who had settled in Florida. And it also included the Creek people who, again, now are called Seminoles. So that's one of the places, but there were places all over the United States. Wherever you had enslaved people, you had marronage. That's the term meaning maroon activity, marronage. You had marronage, maroon activity everywhere, all over the United States. But you did have certain centers that you could say were epicenters of a lot of concentration of maroon activity. One area was the Dismal Swamp, which is not far from DMV, right? In the kind of southern Tidewater area of Virginia, southern part of Virginia, and the northern region of North Carolina. It's supposedly 2,000 square mile area. And this was an area where a lot of enslaved Africans escaped and lived. They actually were able to build, I guess, in places where there were higher ground, they were actually able to build caves underground and live in these caves. And for some reason, even though you had the patrols, you had militias, you had the army, they were never able to penetrate into the Dismal Swamps. So it's a lot of, mystery, surrounding that whole experience. Right now, they're doing archaeological studies, somebody out of Georgetown, and they're not finding a lot of material culture, although they knew they were there, because after the end of the Civil War, you had something like, they say, between 20 and 30,000 enslaved Africans came out of the Dismal Swamp who had been living as free, independent people in the Dismal Swamp.
And the reason the reason that they can't find any remains is because of the environment of the swamp and the nature of the remains that were to be found.
I think that's a possibility, but the archaeologists seem to be surprised that they're not finding more of this material culture. But the thing is, when people are living in secret and hiding, you see what I'm saying? They're not going to leave probably a lot of material culture anyway, right? Because they're trying to erase themselves, all right, from the authorities. So you get the same situation like when you hear about the quilts, how quilts were used on the Underground Railroad, that they were used and designs were sewn into these quilts that indicated where safe houses were, that indicated which direction to go in. And then you have these white, I just call them racist scholars, who try and say, well, that couldn't have happened because we don't have records of it. Because they don't have records, they say it happened, but that was the whole point. It was a secret. Right. So it wasn't something that was going to be put in the library, obviously. So these were secrets that were passed on through the oral tradition. But it was a professor at Howard who wrote a book, Hidden in Plain Sight, where he demonstrates and he shows a lot of these quilts that were used, again, on the Underground Railroad. So the fact that they're not finding material culture doesn't mean it did not exist, because there were certainly a lot of people who had come out of the Dismal Swamp. And I think Max Roach's family, famous jazz musician, had family, in the who were Maroons in that Dismal Swamp area. So that was one major epicenter. The other was the South Carolina region, especially around the Sea Islands, the Gullah people. Many of the Gullah people early on were fleeing to Florida because Florida in the 18th century was colonized by the Spanish, and the Spanish and the British were fighting, they were at war. So the Spanish were giving refuge to enslaved Africans. And in fact, they even had their own regiment, a Mandinka chief by the name of Francisco Menendez. He had been enslaved, brought to here, but escaped from South Carolina and became a captain in the army and defeated the British in a number of battles. So you had that. Then at a certain point, the British got control of Spain for a short time. Menendez was sent away, but the Maroon activity continued. And by the time the Americans are trying to take over, they're trying to bring all of the enslaved Africans who had been there for over a century, or nearly, coming back to even the late 1600s. They're trying to say, well, these are our enslaved people, and we want to bring them back. So they were particularly targeting the Black Seminoles, or the Seminole Maroons. And even though the Native people and the Africans, and enslaved Africans, there was some intermarriage between them, but for the most part, they married among their own. And they lived like close together. But like any confederation, each nation within the confederation has its own autonomy. All right, they had their own chiefs, they had their own council of elders, they had their own translators, and they lived. Yes.
These two groups
Mhm.
Did they share culture, or did the Africans retain their cultural elements, or was there a blending, a syncretism, so to speak?
Um, well, there were a lot of similarities between the Native American cultures and the African cultures. As a matter of fact, because you had a lot of Africans who had been migrating to the United States. That's a whole nother subject. But you did have a number of African migrations, and when you look, really see authentic representations of Native people, especially east of the Mississippi. Many of them look like Africans, and you had major voyages like the voyage from Mali Empire, where you had many West Africans, Mandinkas, Fulani, Soninkes, Moors, who came over in 1311. And they settled in places throughout Brazil, Colombia, Venezuela, throughout the central Florida, even southern United States, where there's a lot of Mandinka language still spoken, a lot of Mandinka artifacts, Mandinka fabrics and housing you see throughout these areas that indicates that that voyage did take place. And it was a large expedition of 30,000 people. They had 1,000 ships of people and 1,000 ships of supplies. So in a few hundred years, those 30,000 will be millions. So you already had peoples here who were of African ancestry. So that's why the cultures were very similar. I have some pictures of the Seminoles, the indigenous Seminoles, that maybe I can show later, and you can see some of the even their clothing. It's very African looking, like the Ndebele people of Southern Africa. You see jewelry that's almost identical. So anyway, there was you know, I guess you could say somewhat a blending of the cultures that were already very similar. So so anyway, the other native peoples that were living in this South, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, and the Seminoles were called the five civilized tribes. Why were they called the five civilized tribes? Because these were the so-called tribes that had kind of made a agreement with the whites that they would assimilate into European culture and engage in the practice of slave hunting and slavery. So this is what they were doing. And even with the Seminole, the indigenous Seminole played a role of being so-called the owners. So when the when Europeans, Euro-Americans tried to take them away and say, okay, these are our enslaved people, the indigenous Seminole would say, no, no, these are our enslaved people. You understand? But they really weren't. You had something, they really weren't. They were really living as free and independent people. So that's the role that they played. You had that same relationship even with Africans who were free and who so-called owned people. And
Yes.
Carnegie Woodson did a study on that. But again, the reasons in many cases were they started passing laws, especially after the Nat Turner Rebellion. They started passing laws where free Blacks could not live in the state. And it varied from state to state, but maybe we say, well, okay, after 30 days or after 60 days. And then it's at another point, they just said, well, we can't have any manumission period throughout the South.
Mm. Sister Kai, you're frozen. It looks like we're having technical difficulties. Everybody, just give me a moment as I try to figure this out. And she's gone. All right. Give us a moment as we figure this out. All right, Sister Kai, you're back.
Yeah, I don't know what happened. It just went off. I don't. I hope it's not something wrong with my computer or whatever. Because my daughter swears it goes off and on all the time, the modem. But I don't see that because I listen to music and I never hear it skipping. But anyway, I don't know what happened.
What year is your computer?
Okay. So it's fairly new. I got it at the end of 2021.
Yeah, it's new.
So I don't know that. I don't think that's that old.
It's not.
It's not that old.
Definitely not. I don't know then.
Yeah. Yeah. But anyway, I was speaking of the Seminole. Where they really benefited each other was when it came to war. And you can kind of see kind of a symbiotic relationship. They both really benefited from this confederation when it came to fighting the Europeans, the Euro-Americans, especially, again, the Americans, who were really a lot worse than the French or the Spanish, right, in their policies. So once the Americans come in and try and take over Florida, they are mainly, as I said, targeting the Black Seminoles or the Seminole Maroon. So they had their own fort, and this was on the Alachua River in the Panhandle. In the Panhandle, they were living along this river. It was called Fort Negro, and in 1816 they attacked. And when they attacked, one of the shots went into the magazine where they had the firearms and gunpowder. So the whole fort blew up and almost 300 people were lost. So many of those survivors kind of scattered, but when they scattered, they regrouped and were engaged in like guerrilla warfare with the Americans and a number of the American Army and a lot of militia volunteers who were part of militias who were fighting for about 2 years. Then they backed off for a little while. Then by the 1830s, now 1835, when Andrew Jackson becomes president and he starts the Indian removal program.
Yeah.
Because the first native peoples who were removed were actually the Choctaw and the Seminole, or supposed to be the Seminole. We hear about the Cherokee and the Trail of Tears. It was actually the Choctaw and the Seminole, but the Seminole, especially the Seminole Maroons, knew they were at risk if they were removed to Indian Territory. At that time, they called it Indian Territory, but it was Oklahoma and actually part of Arkansas. They were in danger of being re-enslaved, so they refused to go. So it's this situation, this Indian removal, and the fact that the Seminoles refused to be removed that ignites the Second Seminole War, which lasted for about 7 years. So if you're talking about 1835 to about 1842, they're engaged in full-scale war with the United States Army. At the time, Zachary Taylor was colonel then. They defeated a battle in which they were fighting with Zachary Taylor, when they lost almost nearly all of their officers. It's called the Battle of Lake Okeechobee. I was just down there a couple of weeks ago, right? Lake Okeechobee.
What state is that in?
Okeechobee. Well, this was by this time, like I said, they were in the Panhandle, but during all the years that they're fighting the guerrilla warfare, they're being pushed further down. Now you're going from like central Florida down a little further down, getting towards the Everglades.
Okay.
The Second Seminole War breaks out. But again, it's a large area that they're operating in because during the Second Seminole War, a lot of enslaved Africans in that area, especially the region from St. Augustine down to Sanford, there were a lot of uprisings then. And the enslaved people joined the Seminole Maroons, and burned down 200 plantations in that region. So now you have more people joining up with the Seminoles during that Second Seminole War, which I said lasted for 7 years. So finally, they make an agreement in which they go to the Indian Territory. But instead of going to the Indian Territory, they went to Mexico because they knew, again, they were in danger of being recaptured and taken back. And I shouldn't even say recaptured. Most of them were born free. They didn't know anything about being enslaved. So they decided to go to Mexico because in Mexico by this time, 1829, the first Mexican president, Vincent Guerrero, was Black. Well, they say Black, Indian, and Mexican, which a lot of us here to have that kind of mix. So, but he was Black. He was opposed to slavery, so they abolished slavery in Mexico in 1829, which is why Texas decided it wanted to, get away. They no longer wanted to be part of Mexico because they wanted to expand slavery. So that's what that real war with Mexico was about, or with Texas and Davy Crockett and all that. But anyway, the Seminoles are in Mexico along the border, along the Texas border. And then you also start getting this kind of second iteration of people joining up with the Seminoles who are now coming from Texas and Louisiana, right? Because number one, Mexico, they would be free people there, and they would also have the protection of the Seminole who were fighting. They were still on the borders, just like they were from the very beginning in Florida. Now they're on the Texas border, keeping out the slave hunters who are constantly trying to come down into Mexico and take them back. So this goes on until the Civil War, the end of the Civil War. By this time, a number of the indigenous Native people had died from malaria, which they didn't have much of an immunity for diseases that were coming from, what we may call the old world, from Europe and Africa. Sure. So they were more susceptible to dying from these epidemics. So many of them had passed away. And then you had the Seminole Maroons coming back, and many of them settling in Texas and other parts of the United States. I actually have cousins who are from this Black Seminole group. And they came into actually Mexico and had fled from Texas and came into Mexico and joined up with the Seminoles there. And then after the war, they came back and became the Buffalo Soldiers. That history, but that is happened. Yeah. But I mean, it's a long and kind of crazy, it's a long, interesting history. But they put up a valiant fight. And when you look at it, they really lasted longer than Palmares, which lasted for about a century. They lasted longer than the Jamaican, or just as long as Jamaican and in Suriname, because they existed for over a century and they were never recaptured.
Professor Kai, you'll have to forgive me. When you said Palmares, I'm not familiar with that.
Okay, Palmares, I'm sorry. There was a large nation state of Maroons in Brazil, particularly in the Bahia region. And it was called Palmares. And it was a quilombo. A quilombo was like a Maroon camp, a Maroon village or settlement. In Spanish, they would call them palenque. In the French, in Louisiana, they called these Maroon communities passage. That was the French word. So Palmares was a large quilombo in Brazil in the 17th century, very early period of Brazil. That lasted for about over a century. You had people like Ganga Zumba, Cocharina actually was founded by a woman named Cocharina, and then you had Ganga Zumba and then Zumbi. Now Zumbi is considered a national hero. In fact, a lot of them are considered national heroes now in Brazil. But there's a movie called Quilombo, Carlos Vegas, and you can go online. It's actually, you can go on YouTube and see it.
Okay.
Quilombo. Classic film. Yeah, classic film. So I'm sorry. I guess.
Oh, no, it's totally fine. I just know when we get into our separate professions, there are certain words or phrases or concepts that we'll say in passing because our colleagues, it's such common knowledge in our profession that we don't know that it's not to others. I knew that's what happened. So it's totally cool. I get it.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know, I just, but you're right, a lot of people may not know about Homerus. So anyway, but like I said, the Seminoles, again, lasted a long time, over 100. If you consider when they started in the late 17th century, late 1600s to 1865.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. That was over 150 years.
And I'm
Going
sure
close,
this is
going
really,
close to going close to 200 years that they lived as free people. So that again, that was major. And even in some of the books about Maroons, they don't talk about them because people think Seminoles, like you think, oh, Native Americans.
yeah.
But yeah, they were Native Americans and Africans, enslaved Africans, or I should say self-liberated Africans, Gullah people. And it's interesting because they still actually speak the Gullah language. And they spoke the Muskogee language, the language of the indigenous people. And they spoke Spanish because, the Spanish were there in Florida for a long time. So they were familiar with Spanish and English. So often the Seminole Maroons served as interpreters, as translators, as well as fierce warriors, because they had the most to lose. So when it came to defending their rights to be free, they were always right up there in the front lines. So you hear people like John Horse, Nehru, Abraham. These are some of the heroes among the Seminoles. And then Osceola, who's an indigenous Seminole, and Wildcat. Yeah, it was some great Billy Bowlegs. So some outstanding heroes that we don't hear enough about. And then in Louisiana, when I talk about the epicenters,
I was
Louisiana.
just about to ask about that because I did a little bit of research on that list you sent me, which was really a lot. But I did learn a lot about the German Coast Uprising. That was amazing history.
Yes,
I want to thank you about that. Yeah.
about 5,000 people involved in that. Yeah, Louisiana was another, I would say, epicenter of Maroon activity. It was again major, partially also because New Orleans was a large port, second largest port in the country. It was even larger than the Charleston, and you had many enslaved Africans who again were brought through that port very early on. I saw something interesting. Even after writing my book and spending years doing research, I'm still learning things every day. And when the African American Museum opened here in DC in 2016, I was shocked to see an exhibit. They had a special section on slavery in Louisiana. And it said, and I copied it verbatim, right, because I was so surprised that they said it. It said that the Maroons controlled vital parts of the Louisiana Territory.
Hmm.
Yes, vital parts of the Louisiana Territory. So they're talking about an area because my book is dealing with the state of Louisiana, which is much smaller, and it's in a time period in the 1850s. They're talking about the 18th century, when before the United States had become the United States, you had large numbers of Maroon communities that controlled vital parts. When they say vital parts, I'm thinking more of like kind of trading centers and towns, major towns and trading centers, which they say vital parts. And that's the word that they use. The first thing that surprised me is that they used the word Maroons without saying what Maroon meant, what a Maroon was, because most of those people probably coming through the museum maybe never heard of Maroons, and I've been at conferences with historians, African American historians, some of the Asala conferences where they didn't know, some historians didn't know what Maroons were. Or if they did, they only heard about them in the context of the Caribbean and South America. they never heard of any Maroon communities here. And it was really not until 2014 that the first kind of comprehensive book on the Maroons in the United States was written. And I have to, take hats off to her. It's Sylviane Diop, the Senegalese scholar and historian who was a curator at the Schoenberg, was running across all these slave narratives, in which she's learned about these Maroon communities. So she did a book called Slavery's Exiles, the story of the Maroons in America. Came out 2014, but that was very late. And prior to that, there was nothing, no book, or maybe some articles. Herbert Aptheker, who did the book, was it 250 slave revolts or something like that?
Yeah.
Slave revolts in America, American Negro slave revolts.
Professor Kai.
250.
Professor Kai, I have a question.
Yes.
I just want to make sure I remember. You said that when the Maroons were in control of vital areas in Louisiana, this was in the 18th century. That would be like when 1700s.
Yeah, before the Louisiana Purchase.
Okay, and so that would and that's that whole, and that would be that Louisiana Purchase area that we're talking about, that like extends from Louisiana all the way up to Canada, is what you're speaking on?
Right. I'm talking about a territory that took up almost half of the United States.
And that's when
was in that period. And see, because we hear about the history of America, they're only talking about British. They don't even get into even what the British did. They're mainly talking about the United States after it becomes the United States of America. That's most of the history we're getting. They weren't trying to find out what the French or the Spanish were doing, except for strategic purposes, right? Because they were all fighting each other. So all of this information would be coming from French and Spanish texts and documentations and manuscripts, not from the English ones.
And then would it be a situation that because it wasn't, the French could not be as invested as the British in their territory, that they couldn't regulate it as much? I'm just conjecturing. And they couldn't regulate it as much. The reason why their Africans were able to establish such successful and strong Maroon colonies in the Louisiana territories at that time?
I think that may be part of it, and really I have been trying to get more information on that. I've been trying to contact the curators, and I have who put that exhibit up. You see what I'm saying? To get more documentation, but I haven't gotten any responses, because I would like to see more details as well. But again, you probably have to go into French documents. But really, that list that I sent you with all of those different rebellions that were taking place, if you notice, early in the 18th century, from 1727 to about 1731. Wait, I'm gonna see if I can find the list. You had Bambara and Mandinka and Senegalese, because again, the French are concentrating their trade on the same regions they end up colonizing, right? So they already have that sphere of influence in the Mali, Senegal, Guinea region. So they're taking people like the Mandinka and the Bambara are coming. And as soon as they come off the ships, when I talk about the port area, they're fighting, right?
Yeah.
They're fighting, and then they're joining with the indigenous people. So this is where I'm thinking, wow, maybe a lot of the Maroon communities started from there, right? Because a lot of them were never taken back. Okay, like for example, 1729 to 1730, the French tried to use enslaved Blacks to fight against the Coromantee Indians.
Yeah.
The enslaved people instead united with the Coromantees to fight the French. So they defeated them. Okay, I was reading about that. They ended up killing hundreds of French soldiers. Right, so they had forces there because, again, uniting with some of the native peoples who are already African and fighting the French. So they defeated them, and probably joined up with the indigenous people or established Maroon communities in these Indian territories, because the Louisiana territory was still Native American territory, right?
Yeah.
All right, 1730, 1731, 7,000 Africans were shipped to Louisiana, again from that Mali, Senegal region. And by the next year, half of them were either dead or had escaped. So that's 3,500, all right, and not counting the families that they're going to be having that are gone, right? And a lot of them probably escaped into, again, these Maroon communities that were part of the Louisiana territory. That's thinking. Numerous rebellions and raids by Maroons, 1782 to 84. There was a man by the name of Juan Malo. He was the leader of several Maroon communities in southern Louisiana. And he was around for about, I don't know, maybe I talk about it here. He was around for a while. And then you had Brock Coupe, who's another kind of legendary Maroon figure. And it's very interesting how a number of whites have tried to rewrite his story and had kind of turned him into, I mean, famous writers like George Washington Cable, who's a famous Louisiana writer, has written a book on him. And it was a book that just recently came out that I saw over at Sankofa. But again, it's putting out this same narrative where he's this kind of Uncle Tom that's beholden to the slave owners rather than the leader of Maroon communities around Sarabayo, not far, about 50 to 100 miles west of Louisiana. But there were several Maroon camps in that area that he had, which was like a captain, or like a captain or leader of these Maroon groups. He was also what was called a Candido, which was like a voodoo prince. And a lot of these Africans who, again, they're bringing their religion, they're bringing their culture, and they're bringing their metaphysics with them. So they had a lot of spiritual knowledge. They had a lot of metaphysical knowledge. So you hear about all these stories about Bra Coupe being bulletproof. You hear the same thing about Nani Akompon. In fact, you hear that about Maroon leaders all over the diaspora. But
being bulletproof?
Yeah. They're supposed to be bulletproof. Nani Akompon was supposed to be bulletproof. He used to dance at Congo Square, which at that time they called it Congo Plains. They said he could jump as high as the trees, so all these different things. And these things, because there was a belief in spiritism, even among whites at the time in the 18th and the 19th century. You would get reports like this in the New Orleans Picayune, in their newspapers, right? How anytime they would go after these Maroons, which they called them just brigands or robbers, right? That they would vanish, they would disappear, right? And never be seen again. So a lot of them were afraid, right? They were afraid to go after the Maroons. I was reading letters from the first governor, Governor Claiborne, American governor of Louisiana, writing letters to James Madison, asking for troops, federal troops. They're writing letters all the time, asking that federal troops be brought to put down these, they call them brigands or outliers. That was another term they use in the United States, outliers for Maroons, or brigands, which is what the authorities call them, meaning they're just bandits. But they're calling all the time for them to come and aid them. In fact, I'm just going to read one of the letters that Governor Claiborne had written, and the response. I thought the response was very interesting. Okay, all right. The letter was dated 1806. General Claiborne is asking for troops to be brought in to put down these Maroon communities. And General Wilkerson writes back and replies, the idea you offered me this morning of calling forth the militia and taking a position for the protection of your territory above is utterly inadvisable. because you could not withstand the desperation and superiority of numbers opposed to you. And the brigands, Maroons, provoked by the opposition, might resort to a dreadful expedient of exciting a revolt of the Negroes. If we divide our force, we shall be beaten in detail. We must therefore condense it here, and in concert with our watercraft rest our main defense at this point. So they were scared to come in, because this is a few years, this is shortly after the Haitian Revolution.
Okay.
And they were literally terrified that what happened in Haiti could happen in the United States. And of course, enslaved Africans were well aware of what had happened in Haiti. You know, the word had gotten out. So you had people who were fighting, like the Denmark Vesey Rebellion, 1822, or the Plan. You know, that was something that had been organized for years in advance. And they had recruited from Mother Emanuel, the same church where this guy Dylan Wolf went in and shot up 9 people. That same church was a church that where they had recruited 20,000 enslaved Africans, mostly in Charleston and surrounding areas, to commit to this revolt. And the idea was that they were going to go to Haiti. They were going to get ships and go to Haiti. That was the plan. Because Haiti, by this time, in their constitution, had offered political asylum and citizenship to people of African descent in the diaspora, United States, in any of the countries of South America, in the Caribbean, and even Africa. Any person of African descent would get citizenship in Haiti. And I understand that there were some African Americans that ended up going in Haiti behind that. I guess some that were free, or some who were able to self-liberate and go to Haiti, and ended up becoming part of the DR, you know, because for a minute Haiti had all of the island, but then it went back. So, but anyway, a lot of, again, Maroon activity that was supported by its very, very powerful voodoo priests. And I have to just mention people like Marie Laveau, who's been demonized. Yeah, who's been demonized mainly because she was so powerful. And then you had Madame Salopi and Samiti Dede and Dr. John. Very, very powerful person. They say this guy, and this would be again in their newspapers, he would make these stones would fall out of the sky. I'm not talking about some little thing, I'm talking about a big stone that would put a hole in your house, roof of your house, or would kill you if it hit you. Stones would be coming down from the sky in New Orleans, and Dr. John was the only one that could make it stop. You know, they would have these, again, these are things that would be in their newspapers. So it was a lot of papers. Yeah, in their newspapers.
Wow.
So, you know, like I said, they were very, very afraid of the voodoo priests there. And they had a lot of, I mean, Marie Laveau, they had a lot of white clients as well, and got a lot of money. I mean, she was very wealthy, but her wealth went through her like a sieve, because it was all given back to the people. You know, thousands of people were fed every day through Marie Laveau, through Dr. John, through these voodoo priests. And they also lended support to Bra Coupe and Juan Malo and other Maroon leaders and Maroon communities were protected.
So it was like an alliance.
Many of them were also voodoo priests themselves. Yeah. So, I mean, part of their success, I think, came from the fact that, again, they were just very, very knowledgeable on many, many levels.
Wow. Professor Kai, I wanted to, if we can end this conversation here, and then maybe even pick it up again at another time to part 2 to this, because it seems like this could be like a series. Like this is deep and interesting.
Yes, yeah, it's possible. I mean, yeah, still a lot, a lot out there to be researched too. I'm seeing that again from, yeah, just the more you think you know, the more you realize you don't know. You know,
And
the more you learn, the more you learn that you don't know. That's all, which is
that's
something
the
that you
truth.
say.
That's the truth. It seems as if though the history of the African in America is extremely complex. In our conversation that we've had, I can even see many conversations that are being had on social media now with people reclaiming their Native American identity. I can see how their conversations are coming about, because there's a growing movement of people that are claiming their Native American identity, but simultaneously denying their Africanness as well, which is not something I agree with. But then listening to our conversation, I can see where some of their discussion and some of their arguments are coming from. And then also just understanding in America the distaste that is kind of bred into our culture for the African, why that conversation is being had. But I can see that the history is not as cut and dry. There's complexities to it.
Yeah, and unfortunately, some who claim Native American ancestry and then renounce the African, I think is unfortunate because Native Americans were Africans. And I understand some of the Moors, this was not the Noble Jew Ali group of Moors, but there's I guess, a new generation of Moors who are saying, yeah, well, we were over here before. And that's true. There were Moors who were here, who were trading with indigenous people, and many who settled here. On that voyage from Mali, there were many Moors on that voyage. There were people from a number of ethnic groups in West Africa. So yes, they were here, but yes, they also came over again on the slave ships, right? So to deny that, I don't know. I think it's a problem, because they're even going so far as to say that the transatlantic slave trade never happened.
Exactly.
And
That is
it's really disturbing, because that's just not true.
you
Even
know,
though the fact that we were here is a fact, that's true. And a lot of us have Native American ancestry, but again, it wasn't that different from uh, they look just like us, really. A lot of them, because they came from different parts of Africa, like some that had come over when Ivan Van Sertima talks about Taharka, and then I think Ramesses III, and then the Canaanites, who are also called the Phoenicians by the Greeks. They were great sailors and navigators, and they came over. The Mayan people actually were a Canaanite group that sailed over many years ago. That's in their sacred book, the Popol Vuh.
the
They
what?
talk about, yeah. And when you see it, when you look at those, especially in Mexico, when you look at the Mayans and the Aztecs, but especially the Mayans, they looked like any African group you would see. They had long dreadlocks. The priests had dreadlocks. So you're seeing all these black people, and the Cherokee supposedly came from the Mayans. They migrated. They were a branch of the Mayans that migrated into the southern United States. So you see a lot of these people, they're very dark, but they may have wavy or straight hair. But you can see that, say, for example, among the Nubians and Goramonte and Zagua, a lot of very, very dark-skinned people that have kind of straight hair, or they'll have hair like a texture that I've never really seen here that is actually kind of like wolf's hair, right? Um, so this is what you have with Native Americans. I have a lot of pictures of them, and like I said, they look just like any black person you would see. And my interest in that came when I was studying in the Sudan, and it was called African and Asian Center at the University of Khartoum. And I ran into this brother, this Nubian brother, who told me that Mississippi was a Nubian word, and Missouri, Mississippi meant mud and water. And the word Missouri meant floodplains. Then he went into all these other words. Uruguay, Paraguay meant north, south. Argentina meant cow. and even whole phrases like Wekatisata, do not kill anyone. In this language, so he's doing this research, and really, as it turns out, the Algonquin language, which is the largest language group among Native Americans, is Nubian. And that's when, after that, everywhere I went, I would go to the libraries and archives, especially going out west, and look at the pictures. So you had Edward Sharif Curtis, who was a photographer, and he did a lot of pictures, took a lot of pictures of Native Americans before they died out, although he was mainly concentrating on the West. But you can see the Mojave and a lot of these Native people, again, just African, the Susquehanna, the Wampanoag, who were the Native peoples who the Pilgrims greeted the Wampanoag. The Wampanoag were a great branch of the Narragansett. My mother has friends down in Florida who are Narragansett, and I say, oh, those are the Native people who look like African Americans. When you see them, they just look like any African American. You say that's what we are, African Americans. So a lot of them, they know that history as well. The Narragansett, the Susquehanna, the Shawnee, Tecumseh. We've heard of Tecumseh, how he was trying to unite Pontiac. These were all Black Indians, and again, the ones that we mentioned in the South. And I wish I don't have the pictures of some of them. You see what I'm speaking of. But to say that we did not come here as enslaved people, I'm hearing that more and more too.
Yeah,
or they're trying to numbers.
That conversation is heavy in different social media spaces, and it's really sad to hear, because they're just consistent African origin deniers. That is just it's just really sad.
Yeah, why would they deny that? Come on, the Moors came from Africa. I don't quite get that. But another thing that is problematic is this notion about African Americans, and Henry Louis Gates, and I respect a lot of things that he does, but a lot of things that he's done I think is damaging. And that's this assertion, you hear him say it over and over and over. How many of you are Native American, have Native American ancestry? He'll be in an audience with mostly Black people. Most people will raise their hand. He said, well, nope, that's not true. Only 7% of African Americans have Native American ancestry, according to their DNA analysis, right? So you got people like Elizabeth Warren, okay, who had always been told she was whatever. I mean, she looks phenotypically white, but right. She could have actually come from Native Americans who had come from Africa. The problem is they're using this Bering Strait model. And they're also trying to say the Native Americans came across the Bering Straits. That's where they came from. They're not looking at the fact that most of them had come from Africa. You see what I mean? They're ignoring that. And that's also very deliberate as well. So when they do the testing, they're testing the Eskimo, the Siberian, the one that came over, the Eskimo and some of the Apache and other kind of Asian looking groups, or like the people of Southern Russia. No, that's not where we came from. So you're using that DNA model and ignoring the African one. So now they're telling a lot of African Americans who've always known that they came from that Native American parentage as well, right? And that's been passed on in the family, that think they've been living a lie. Holly Robinson Pete's mother, for example, because Holly Robinson Pete, they're supposed to be from Cherokee. That's what they had always learned. DNS said, no, you're not from you don't have any Native American. But they're using some model, but no, that's not us. So that's become a problem. I talked to I think it's Lisa Page from AfricanAncestry.com. She's done a lot. They've really done a lot of good work, but I was telling her, I think that's the problem. Because we know good and well, it was as much cohabitation and intermarriage between Native Americans and African Americans as it was with the rapists who raped our mothers. It's been as much. So we know that 7% is wrong. We know it's wrong.
This is interesting. This is interesting. Because many of your talking points, I've definitely heard in the conversations with these brothers and sisters. It is interesting. You know, I do remember W.B. Du Bois making the statement, the relationship between the Native American and the African has been the least explored and has to be explored to understand and get a better grip on our history and our connections together. He didn't say it exactly like that, but it was something along those lines. And so definitely a field in which more research has to be done.
Definitely. Well, you know, there also used to be this group called the Painted Gourd Society. I don't know if you remember them.
The Painted Gourd?
When I first came to DC, yeah, they were a large Native American group that, you know, that looked just like any African American. They group of Native Americans, some of them were Wampanoag, some of them were Narragansett, some of them were Powhatan, some of them were Mohawk, all Black, right? And when they used to have the Columbus Day celebrations, they used to have big things over at Howard, right, around Columbus. We weren't celebrating Columbus, it was like anti-Columbus, right? So the Painted Gourd Society would be at some of those conferences. But anyway, I remember this guy who was Powhatan, and you know, the Powhatan was very much in this DMV area. He was saying that this area among the Powhatan, the term was called, the area was called Atan Akamet, kind of like your name, right? Atan Akamet. You know, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that's a committing term.
Right.
So you have, and this is again, when they say the language, Nubian language, he's telling me all these words that are Nubian words. The Algonquin language. Atan Akamet. So yeah, it is something that definitely needs to be definitely studied. Yeah.
I gotta look that up. I hope I can find some information on the Algonquin and Nubian language connections.
Yeah, he was a Powhatan that said that.
All right, Sister Nubia. Professor Kai, thank you so much for your presence. I definitely appreciate this. This was a deep conversation, very deep conversation.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you know. Yeah, I'm glad you asked me to do it. And the fact that you were interested in it as a young person. Because, you know, we were just talking about that yesterday, how we get young people interested. It's difficult, you know, and I felt like maybe it was our failing because we didn't fulfill our mission. Like Frantz Fanon said, each generation out of relative obscurity must either fulfill their mission or betray it. I don't think we really betrayed it, but I don't think we fulfilled it. And so the momentum, because we've lost momentum in the movement, because we were ready to put our life on the line back in the 60s and 70s, and we don't want to do that now. The generations behind us, you know, they're lagging too because we're lagging. I mean, that's what I feel.
You know, this struggle for liberation that our people are engaged in, or this struggle for identification and then right knowledge and right positioning, it's ongoing, constant, ever molding, ever changing, adapting and adjusting to the newness that's occurring at all aspects. Like the 1960s generation had no clue about the internet. You know, it was like the television. I think the television was still a relatively new phenomenon. I don't even think 15 years old by the 1960s. And so, you know, and I do remember seeing and knowing that around then that that the news was just becoming aware. The television was competing with radio, I think, in trying to get listenership. And so they broadcast one of the reasons why the civil rights movements was broadcast over the television so much was because of the sensationalist nature of it and the viewership. And so that's that's what helped television overtake radio at the time. I remember. So, but that's not the internet. There's differences in we have to constantly adjust. There has to be some serious conversations that have to be had, and not just conversations, because there's talk. There has to be a movement, like something has to move in a certain direction, and people are going to have to begin to take sovereign movements are communal, a more communal based action in reference to where we're living at in our relationship with the United States as we progress and move forward. These are conversations that have been had before, but they need to be continuously had, and then there needs to just be more movement based around them. Because what ends up happening, I see, is that material comfort is of more importance than historical or cultural identity. People are more concerned about gaining skills to earn money than having these type of discussions and conversations.
Yeah, I guess you're right.
That's what I've noticed. My generation just wants to earn money, and that's what it comes down to. So these are conversations definitely had. It was a blessing. Thanks to you, sister. Thanks to the ancestors. And I hope to have this conversation again.
Okay. All right.
All right.
Okay.
Peace.
All right. Okay. Peace and blessing. Thanks again.